Sometimes when I'm reading scripture, I will look at the passage and try to imagine it in a drama, in a movie, or on a play somewhere, and just try to see, what their facial expressions are, where they are, how they interact, just anything to bring the scripture more life, rather than just reading it on a flat page with a flat voice. And today's scripture, I think, really, really calls for that method because we've got two of the phrases that if you were raised in a Christian home, you would have heard at some point. The two being, "Get behind me, Satan," and "Pick up your cross," or "Bear your cross to bear." They've really affected the Christian imagination, and oftentimes they're interpreted in ways that don't sync with what the Bible was actually talking about at the time. So it's really helpful to kind of just imagine the situation, imagine the setting. What we have here today is Jesus with his followers. Now, last week we were looking at Jesus asking, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter making the critical statement, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." A lot of scholars break the book of Matthew into three sections. So the first is his birth narrative, and the second is his public ministry, ending with that statement of faith of Peter. That's the crescendo of the message. So this week we're kind of starting part 3, the final part of the Gospel of Matthew. And it's at this point in time that we pivot from Jesus' ministry in Galilee to what he's going to face when he finally gets in Jerusalem. To Jerusalem. And this time, this passage that we're looking at today is the first time that Jesus tells his disciples what he's going to face, that he's going to face accusations, and he's going to come against the learneds and the authorities in the temple, and he's going to be tortured and abused and killed and rise up on the third day. We know all of this because we are post-resurrection people. But the disciples in the story were not post-resurrection. They didn't even know what was going to happen, what Jesus was talking about. So one of the challenges for us is to get the resurrection out of this story because it doesn't help us understand what's going on. When we remove the resurrection, then we start to look at more of the words, what's going on. So here we have Peter responding immediately and saying, "Lord, don't say that. There's got to be another way to do this." And Jesus turning on him and saying, "Get behind me, Satan. Do not tempt me." Now, full stop on that one. Not only do we have to get the resurrection out of the way, but we have to get medieval thought and art out of the way as well. The medieval community was not illiterate like we have assumed they were, but they weren't highly literate. They knew enough to get by, but they certainly didn't have books that they could practice reading on. They didn't have Bibles. So the artwork around them became their understanding of Scripture and of the stories. Amazing sculptures and stained glass and murals in the front of churches and around the side were how they remember the Scripture. I remember going into a small kitchen in a beguinage in Belgium, and behind the stove they had these little tiles with Bible stories on them, so that when whoever was over the stove, they could see these stories being told right behind them in blue and white tiles. So the art was everywhere. And one of the progressions of the Middle Ages, of course, was the Black Death. And we're kind of familiar with the little bit of what a major disease can do. And the Black Death wiped out about half the population of the world at the time, of the late Middle Ages time. So imagine, all of that destruction and death and fear, and they didn't have our scientists. They didn't have our medical system. They didn't have any knowledge of what was going on. So the artwork got darker and darker and darker, and it started to merge Greek art and Roman art and Viking art to create a Satan figure that we're all familiar with today. The red beast, big horns, long tail, surrounded by fire. That has influenced also how we have interpreted the Scripture. So as I said, not only do we have to get resurrection out of the way, we have to get medieval art out of the way. When Jesus is saying, "Get behind me, Satan," he is not saying, "Get behind me, you personification of evil." He's saying, "Get behind me, temptation." Because in the Hebrew tradition, Hasatan is temptation. It is not this warlord of death that is often interpreted today. And if you picture Jesus telling these people of his impending death, that cannot be an easy thing to say. Regardless of whether or not he was fully God, he was still fully human. It was going to hurt. No one goes willingly into something knowing they're going to get hurt without a very good reason. And here is Peter trying to be a friend, saying, "No, there's got to be another way we can do this. Don't say this." You know, that kind of thing happens every day. Well-meaning friends tell us to change our path. When we are called to do something and it doesn't fit with how they understand things should happen, they try to be helpful and say, no, you can do this another way, or that's really not something you can accomplish. And they're not doing it to be mean necessarily. They're doing it to save us from the hard road that we've chosen. Peter was saying this to stop Jesus from going down the hard path. And imagine Jesus' perspective. He has steeled himself. He has told his friends, his closest men and women that he has followed him the last 3 years, and probably beforehand, maybe growing up in their childhood home, maybe friends of his parents, told them he is heading to his death willingly. That takes a lot of personal strength. And suddenly someone is trying to nip at that strength and say, no, you can do it differently. We would all react, do not get in my way. Do not take me away from where I'm called to be. So you can understand the dynamic between Peter and Jesus. Peter does not want the bad things to happen for his friend. Jesus knows what he has to do, regardless of what it's going to cost him. And this sets the stage for the rest of the passage, where Jesus says that we have to give up things in order to do what we're called to do. And it goes into the passage of taking your cross and bearing it. Now, if you were to Google "bear your cross" or "take up your cross," you're going to find a whole lot of pictures of people walking across fields and flower gardens and barren pathways, pulling a huge wooden immaculate cross with them. That's not what this means. Again, resurrection out of the way. We haven't got there yet. When Jesus told people, bear your cross, it was bear your responsibilities. Bear your choices. Don't take the easy way out. Go with what it is you know you have to do, no matter who is going to try to turn you away from that path, well-meaning or otherwise. Do what you are called to do. And we see this on a daily basis. This week alone, in the last few days, in fact, we have seen 2 young men die who chose to stand in the way to protect others. They took their cross seriously, and they died from it. Not that long ago, a young woman did the same thing in Carolina, I believe it was, and she was rammed by a car. That was her cross. She stood up. She didn't have to be there. And these two men didn't have to be there because they were at protest against racism, and they were white. They didn't have to be there because they could walk away. Just like Peter telling Jesus he could walk away, other people could have told these folks that risked their lives and ultimately died that they could have walked away. They could have put down that struggle. It didn't have to be theirs. And we see it through history. This passage brings up a book by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was murdered by the Nazis, and he resisted Nazi oppression in Germany. And he wrote a book called The Call of Discipleship, where this passage is central. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, again, a Christian priest, he could have walked away at any point in time. He could have followed the advice of the Peters around him and just not stood up to the point of death. But he didn't. He stood up and he made a difference. Now, I'm not suggesting that every standing up is going to lead to death, because these are the fact that we know these in numbers and their names means that they're few and far between, thank heavens, but they exist. In the meantime, there are all these other people who are also standing with the people who get killed, standing with the people who are protesting and get abused, standing with the people who are shot, standing with the people who are fighting over land rights, standing with the people who are trying to preserve the environment right around the world. This is their cross to bear. And they are taking that responsibility and bearing it, even when, for a lot of people, it will be easier to just walk away. So the third part of the passage is Jesus saying, when you give your life to me, you'll gain it. When you want to be concerned about earthly things and keep your comforts around you, you will lose it. When you are called to do something, big or small, but something meaningful in the lives of others, and you take the easy out, you're not gaining the life that Christ can give you. You're losing what you could have been able to accomplish. I'm an activist from way, way back. And one of the old chestnuts in activist communities is we can't do anything about this on the ground because the issue is systemic, meaning we have to change the social structures, we have to change the government agencies and the health agencies and the policing agencies and the education agencies. And while that's true, in the meantime, people are starving and they're homeless and they're needing health care. And this assumption that a systemic change is the only thing we can do is peters out. Because those who talk about systemic change but don't actually get their hands dirty at the same time are like those folks who want to have the easy way out. They're not willing to lose their life for someone else that matters. They're not willing to give up their comfort. And that, by the way, that's privilege right there. When you have the comfort and you can walk away from a problem, that's privilege. And Jesus is telling us, don't cash in on our privilege. Be the ones who step out. And I got to tell you firsthand, following your calling is not easy. It's not going to get you rich. It's going to ruin friendships. It's going to put you in places where you're never going to be completely at home. But the riches that come as a result are so much more profound. A sense that you are on a journey and contributing to what needs to happen. You won't win, friends. It will not be a popularity contest. You will face hardship, potentially death. Most of us won't, but some will. But choosing to follow Jesus to this new world that he keeps telling us about, that we have to be co-workers and co-creators in this new environment. It is what we're called to be. Taking the easy out means that we don't ever get a chance to be our full potential of faith people. And the world is crowded with people who want to make us take the easy out, the way Peter was suggesting to Jesus. Sometimes because, as I said, they love us, they care for us, they don't want to see us hurt. But sometimes because they are so comfortable and content in their world, they don't want you rocking the boat. Sometimes you just got to rock the boat. You've got to make that choice. Jesus is now turning in the scripture towards Jerusalem, towards death, towards struggle, towards challenge, towards pain, towards a whole lot of things that we really don't want to think about, and the disciples at the time didn't want to think about either. To be his disciples, we have to do the same thing. We're not necessarily marching towards the cross. We're not necessarily marching towards any kind of pain or death or abuse. But if we don't start marching towards the place where change will happen, then we are not being faithful to that creed that Peter provided us for last week, that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, the Messiah needs people to work around him. That's us. We can bring a new way of doing things, not an easy out, but an opportunity to change the world. We have to make that risk, because if we're not prepared to make that risk, our faith is meaningless.